So this is the historical village of Eureka, Montana, in northwest Montana, in the Tobacco Valley. The village that Darris Flanagan was talking about. And these are historical buildings to the village. And this is the historical main drag, the Dewey Avenue, US 93 that takes you up to Canada. Greetings, so Jess Romero here. I am with Darris Flanagan, and we are at the Eureka Historic Village. And Darris is actually very intelligent, very knowledgeable individual who is from this area. His family is, and he's written several different books. Him and another gentleman by the name of Gary Montgomery. And so I've been coming to this location quite a few times, and some of the pictures that I've shared is already of this. So I was just gonna have Darris answer a few questions and give us a little bit of a general history of the Eureka and just the general Tobacco Valley history. Okay. So what can you tell us about this particular village?
Well, this village was, this valley was first settled by cattlemen. And some of the first cattlemen that came in about 1890 picked this spot for their homestead, and they filed on it. And so this was originally a homestead, but it was for raising cattle. That was followed by, in 1903, the train came in. Mm-hmm. That created a new industry of logging and the mills. And so across the railroad track, which is 100 yards from here, was one of the biggest sawmills in the state at that time. And they used part of this part of this museum area as stacking their lumber and whatnot. And the mill part was actually across the tracks. And then that was followed by Christmas trees, which was a big industry here for about 50 years, from about 1930 to 1980, 90. And so that's kind of the history of this land. The village itself started because in 1970 they were building Libby Dam, and Libby Dam was going to flood the town of Rexford. And so some of the citizens got together and thought we should save some of those buildings from Rexford, and they decided to do that. So this store that we're in front of, along with the train depot and the church from Rexford, were moved up here in the 1970s. It was quite a job to bring this big store. It came down the main street of Eureka and had to come down that steep hill,
which is Dewey Avenue.
And then right where that car is right now was a bridge, and they had 4 inches to spare to get this store across that bridge, and they were able to do it. But the Lincoln Electric, which owned this land, it's a co-op, used the buildings they brought in, and they owned them. They used it for storage for the big tunnel that's up Trigo, because it was so electrified that they needed the storage.
The big tunnel for the train, correct?
Right. So when the tunnel got completed, they didn't need this storage, and the idea always was that it would be made into a museum. Okay. So in 1972, this area was leased to the county, or was sold to the county, but like for $1, with the idea it would become a museum. Mm-hmm. The county turned around and leased it to us to run as a museum, and so the other buildings were later brought in, And that's kind of the start of this museum.
Very interesting. And so, this Eureka is located in the
Did you
Tobacco
need some?
Valley. So I was saying, so Eureka is located in the Tobacco Valley. What can you tell us about the Tobacco Valley?
The Tobacco Valley is named, first of all, by David Thompson, who was the first white journeyman to come down the Kootenai River. He named it because at that time the Kootenays were growing some kind of plant.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows what it was, but they called it tobacco.
And the Kootenai are
the Indians in this area.
okay.
They call themselves the Tanaka.
Okay.
And when about the same time David Thompson came down, the Cree Indians started to trade for white man's tobacco, which was so much easier to grow that pretty soon the Kootenays quit growing their tobacco and relied on white man tobacco. But the name stuck, and so it's the Tobacco Valley.
Very interesting. And so, what's the time period that you would say, from what you understand, that the Kootenai tribe people dwelt in this land before the pioneers came?
There's been a lot of studies, and about 10,000 years ago, the Kootenai traded. What's unusual about the Kootenai is that their language is unrelated to any other tribe.
Right.
And so, at one point, some anthropologists believe that maybe they were an offshoot of the Blackfoot tribe. There seems to be just enough that maybe they were related, but they have a language that's all their own. It's a very tough language, very guttural.
Right. And so in this, I think before you had told me about how the Kootenai, they used to traverse and go hunting a couple times a year from this location. And where did they go to?
Okay, the Kootenai had plenty of animals here, but they loved buffalo. And so to get buffalo, they had to cross the mountains.
Right.
They did it 3 times a year, the spring, the fall, and the winter. The winter trip, they said, was the easiest because it was on snow shoes, and they could walk across a lot of the downfall and stuff.
Right.
In the spring, they went as a very large group, taking many. Some people feel 400 or more horses, and they would go. It's about 100-mile trip,
Right.
and it would take them 4 days. And then the winter trip took about 10 days. In the fall, they went again, but they went kind of as family groups, and they took their time. They might hunt bighorn sheep in Glacier Park or
Right.
elk someplace or whatever. But the ultimate was to always end up with some buffalo.
So we're in northwest Montana, so they would travel east across the northern Rockies of the United States of Montana, which is Glacier National Park today, and go east of that, and that's where they would hunt, correct?
Well, after they went through Glacier Park, they went through the very northwest corner. And then they went into Canada to basically the Waterton Lake area.
Oh, very interesting.
Now, the Flatheads, who live south of here, they would go further out into the plains, but the Kootenai always stayed close to the mountains.
Okay, that's very interesting. And so earlier you mentioned that with the logging, that, for example, in the peripheral part of Ukraine, of Eureka, you have cities like Fortine and Trigo. Could you tell us just briefly a little bit about those two little towns and how they're connected to Eureka?
If you were to ask me where I'm from and I live in Fortine, I'm probably going to say Eureka, because we're very much associated with Eureka. That's where we go to high school. That's where we do shopping, whatever. So Fortine itself kind of started with the railroad. It was actually across from where it was now, but it started with a railroad. Trigo was really more into the logging for their start. But yeah, they're just little towns. Fortine at one time did have motels and stores and stuff like that. But yeah, eventually they just became, I don't know if you want to call them suburbs, but part of Eureka. But really they're 10 miles or 12 miles away.
Right. And what could you tell us briefly about, because coming down from is part of US 93, which goes into Canada. This is a very historic route right here. So going that way about 7 to the Canadian border, what can you tell us quickly about the Canadians and how important this little town of Eureka is, especially with regard to individuals coming to and from Canada?
Well, first of all, in the very early years, there practically wasn't a border. We went back and they went back and forth. So, but as the border developed, some of the after effects was the Kootenays didn't like the way the Americans ran their organization down here, and so they moved across the border and they have a reservation back there. For the people of Eureka, basically until Prohibition, when they really started to enforce the border, they would go back and forth routinely. They would have Saturday night dances across the border in Roosevelt or whatever.
Right.
So, but then as the border developed, of course, that separation. But even when I was in school, we had students from Canada that went to school here.
Right. And you've actually written a book recently about the Prohibition era and some of the wild escapade stories from this area, haven't you?
Yes, it was a fun book to do because Prohibition was so enforced, often with bribes. People could bribe the legal authorities, do what they wanted, and yet you'd have some honest ones that there was law officers that people would float down the Kootenay and they would stay up at night trying to catch people floating their booze down the Kootenay.
Right.
Cars were run and it was a mad race when they got across the border. The law officers would go after them.
Right.
So it was a fun time for a lot of people in Eureka, except that our lumber industry had died, so there wasn't a lot of work, and a lot of them turned to bootlegging.
Right. Interesting. Well, I thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Anybody who ever comes to Northwest Montana wants to check out Eureka, this village here at the beginning of coming into the town of Eureka is open. Mainly what parts of the year?
Well, during the summer we're open from Memorial Day to Labor Day.
Right.
But we give special tours if somebody wants to tour the museum during the winter or whatever. But the buildings aren't heated.
Right, right, yeah. It gets pretty cold here and we can historically get quite a bit of snow.
Yes.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, well, thank you.